You've probably walked past someone sitting on the street corner, cup in hand, eyes either lowered or staring straight ahead. And in that moment, a thought crosses your mind. Maybe it's sympathy, maybe it's discomfort, maybe it's a silent question about how they ended up there or why they don't just try harder to change their situation. We've been taught to see these moments in a very specific way. The person asking for help is powerless. The person walking by has everything figured out. One has failed at life, the other is succeeding. But what if the real story happening in that moment has almost nothing to do with success or failure and everything to do with something we rarely talk about? The stories we tell ourselves about what's possible. Because here's what's interesting. The beggar on the street and the executive in the high-rise are often running the same internal software. They're both operating from a mindset, a framework of beliefs about reality that dictates what they can see, what they can attempt, and what they believe they deserve. The difference isn't always effort or intelligence or even opportunity. Sometimes it's just the story. Let me tell you about a man I'll call David. This is a story that's been told in different versions across cultures, but the psychology underneath it remains the same. David spent years on the same street corner, same spot, same cup, same routine. People would drop coins, sometimes a bill. He'd nod, sometimes say thank you, and the day would continue. It became his identity. This is who I am, this is what I do, this is all there is. One day, someone stopped, not to give money, but to ask a question. They asked David what he'd really want to do if he could do anything. And David, probably surprised, maybe even annoyed, said something about owning a small shop, selling things, having a place of his own. The person listened, then said something that sounds almost too simple to matter. They said, "So why aren't you selling something right now?" David didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had 100 answers, all variations of the same theme. I can't. I don't have the resources. Nobody would buy from me. I'm a beggar. That's not how it works. But the question stayed with him. And a few days later, he tried something small. He bought a pack of gum with the money he'd collected. He sat in his usual spot, but instead of just holding out his cup, he held out the gum. He offered something in exchange, and people responded differently. Not everyone, but enough, because now the transaction had changed. He wasn't asking for pity, he was offering value, however small. Within weeks, David was selling small items, batteries, lighters, things people needed. Within months, he'd saved enough to rent a tiny stall. The street corner beggar became a street vendor, and then a small shop owner. Same person, same street at first, different mindset. Now, before this sounds like some bootstrap fantasy about positive thinking, let's be clear about what actually happened here psychologically. This isn't about willpower or just deciding to think differently. This is about something researchers call a fixed versus growth mindset, a concept psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades studying. But more than that, it's about the invisible cage of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness was first observed by Martin Seligman in the late 1960s. In his experiments, when subjects were repeatedly exposed to situations where they had no control over negative outcomes, they eventually stopped trying to escape, even when escape became possible. They learned that their actions didn't matter, so they stopped acting. This is what happens to people in poverty, yes, but it also happens to people in abusive relationships, dead-end jobs, creative blocks, and cycles of anxiety. The circumstances teach you that effort is pointless, and once you've learned that lesson deeply enough, you stop seeing opportunities that are right in front of you. Not because you're lazy or broken, but because your brain has created a very efficient pattern. Why waste energy on actions that won't change anything? What makes David's story powerful isn't that he worked hard. People in poverty often work incredibly hard. What changed was the framework. Someone asked him a question that interrupted the pattern. What do you actually want? And then, more importantly, why can't you start now with what you have? Those questions created what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The gap between "I want to sell things" and "I am currently not selling things" became uncomfortable enough that his brain had to resolve it. And in resolving it, he found a small action. Not a complete solution, just one tiny deviation from the script he'd been running.
This is where we need to pause and get honest with ourselves, because this isn't just a story about someone experiencing poverty. This is a story about any moment when we tell ourselves that change is impossible until conditions are perfect. How many times have you said, "I'll start that project when I have more time. I'll make that change when I have more money. I'll pursue that dream when I'm more qualified"? We're all running some version of learned helplessness in certain areas of our lives. We've all convinced ourselves that some cage we're in is locked, when maybe, just maybe, the door was never actually bolted. The philosopher Epictetus, who himself was born a slave in ancient Rome, wrote that we suffer not from the events in our lives, but from the judgments about them. He knew something about constraints. He knew something about the difference between actual imprisonment and mental imprisonment. And what he understood was that mindset isn't some fluffy concept. It's the difference between seeing a wall and seeing a door. But let's also be careful here. This isn't about blaming people for their circumstances. Systemic poverty is real. Trauma is real. Mental illness is real. Brain chemistry is real. Telling someone to just change their mindset when they're facing genuine barriers isn't just unhelpful, it's cruel. What we're talking about is something more subtle. We're talking about the space between circumstance and response. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, called this the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. He wasn't saying circumstances don't matter. He was saying that even in the worst circumstances, the meaning you make and the actions you take are still yours. So what does this mean practically? It means that changing your life doesn't always require changing your circumstances first. Sometimes it requires changing what you're looking for within your circumstances. David didn't leave the street corner initially. He just looked at it differently. He asked, "What can I do right here, right now, with what I already have?" This is uncomfortable because it returns responsibility to us, not blame, responsibility, the ability to respond. And that's terrifying because it means we can't hide behind our excuses anymore. It also means we have more power than we thought. Both truths exist at once. The beggar who becomes a vendor doesn't prove that poverty is a choice, but he does prove that identity is more flexible than we think. The story you tell about who you are and what you're capable of, that story has weight. It shapes what you attempt. It shapes what you notice. It shapes what becomes possible. Here's what neuroscience tells us. Your brain is designed to prove yourself right. If you believe you're helpless, your brain will filter reality to show you evidence of helplessness. If you believe small actions can compound, your brain will start noticing opportunities for small actions. This isn't magical thinking. This is confirmation bias, and it's always operating. The question is, what are you confirming? Maybe the most radical thing you can do is ask yourself David's question. What would I do if I believed it was possible? And then the follow-up, what's the smallest version of that I could try right now? Not someday, not when things are perfect, right now, with what you have, where you are. Because the truth underneath this whole story is simple. The life you're living is built on the thoughts you've been thinking. Change the thoughts and the actions change. Change the actions and the results change. Change the results and the story changes. It's not instant, it's not easy, but it's available. The beggar's cup and the vendor's table aren't that far apart. Sometimes it's just one question, one small action, one moment of believing that maybe, just maybe, the door was never locked. If this resonated with you, the next video explores how our past doesn't have to define our future and why some people seem to break free from their history while others stay trapped. It's a continuation of what we've talked about here, but from a different angle. I think you'll find it clarifies some things. Thanks for watching.